Before the vampire ever learned to bare its teeth, fear already knew how to breathe. It moved softly through early human settlements, settling into the silence after death. Not as a creature, not as a story, but as a question that refused to remain buried. When the body cooled and the breath left the chest, something lingered, an uncertainty that pressed against the mind like a half-remembered dream. In the earliest centuries of human memory, death was not distant. It lived close to the hearth, beside the cradle, beneath the soil just beyond the village edge. People watched loved ones fade slowly, breath thinning, skin paling, eyes dimming in ways no language yet understood. And when death arrived, it did not always behave as expected. The dead did not always rest. Long before folklore sharpened fear into monsters, communities across Europe, Asia, and the ancient Near East shared a quieter anxiety. That death was not a clean boundary, but a fragile threshold. That the body, though still, might continue its story unseen. Graves were not places of closure. They were places of observation. In a world without anatomy or decay theory, the body became a site of interpretation. A swelling abdomen, a groan from settling gases, blood at the mouth. These were not biological processes. They were messages. Signs that something within the corpse had not yet surrendered its appetite for life. This fear had no name, because it had not yet learned how to speak. Archaeology reveals this unease etched into burial practices stretching back thousands of years. Bodies pinned with stones, limbs bound, mouths packed with earth. Graves weighted, reinforced, sealed as though something inside might rise if given the chance. These were not acts of cruelty, nor of superstition. They were acts of prevention. To early humans, the dead were unpredictable. There was no clear moment when a person became fully gone. Death unfolded slowly. First breath, then warmth, then recognition. And even after burial, the body continued to change. Hair seemed to grow. Nails appeared longer. Blood darkened and seeped. The corpse bloated, as if inhaling again. To modern eyes, these are natural processes of decomposition. But to those who watched without knowledge, they felt deliberate, purposeful, almost willful. If the dead could change, could they also act? This question haunted early civilizations more deeply than any later monster ever would. Because it did not belong to myth, it belonged to experience. In many ancient cultures, the soul was not believed to depart instantly. It lingered, it wandered, it hovered near the body, uncertain of its destination. Some traditions believed the spirit required time to detach from flesh. Others believed improper burial could trap it between worlds. And in that liminal space, fear took root. If the soul remained too long, it could sour. If the body was disturbed, the spirit might return angry. If death came suddenly or violently, something might be left unfinished. The dead in these beliefs were not evil, but unstable. The earliest fear was not of monsters. It was of unfinished humans. This anxiety appears again and again in ancient texts and oral traditions. In Mesopotamian laments, the dead wander thirsty. In early Slavic belief, the improperly buried linger near the living. In Greek thought, the restless dead required appeasement, not destruction. Before the vampire, there was the revenant, not yet a predator but a presence. A shadow that moved through illness and exhaustion. A suspicion that something unseen was draining vitality from the living. When sickness spread through a household after a death, cause and effect blurred. The dead were not passive. They were involved. In villages struck by famine or plague, fear did not need imagination. Needed explanation. Why did the healthy weaken? Why did bloodlines collapse in sequence? Why did death seem to ripple outward from a single grave? Without science, meaning filled the gap. The dead were still participating. This belief reshaped how the living behaved. Death rituals grew precise. Bodies were washed, positioned, guarded. The mouth was watched. The eyes were closed firmly. Sharp objects were avoided, lest the corpse be offended. Burial became a negotiation, not an ending. And beneath it all lived a deeper dread, that identity itself might not dissolve at death. That memory, hunger, or resentment could survive the grave. This fear was intimate. It was not cinematic. It unfolded in silence, in sleepless nights, in the way villagers avoided graveyards after sunset, in the way children were warned not to call a dead person's name aloud, because names carried power, and once named, fear could be summoned. But in this earliest chapter of human belief, the fear remained unnamed. It existed as sensation rather than story. A tightening in the chest when passing a fresh grave. A lingering glance at the burial mound to ensure it remained still. The dead were close. Too close. Only later would this unease crystallize into figures, myths, and warnings. Only later would it learn how to wear a face. For now, fear was shapeless. Did not stalk. It waited. And in that waiting, humanity revealed something essential about itself. Not a terror of monsters, but a terror of uncertainty. Of not knowing when life truly ends. Of not knowing whether love, hunger, or identity can fully dissolve. The vampire would come much later. But this fear, this quiet suspicion that death might not finish its work, was already alive. And it was watching from the grave. Blood was once more than matter. It was a language the body spoke when words failed. In early human belief, blood did not simply nourish the flesh, it testified. Its warmth signaled life's presence, its color marked vitality, and its movement implied intention. To bleed was to weaken. To retain blood was to endure. And to find blood where it should no longer exist was to confront the possibility that death had not completed its work. Long before violence became its dominant symbol, blood was read as evidence of continuity. Across ancient burial sites and medieval graveyards, the presence of blood unsettled the living more deeply than decay. Rot was expected. Disintegration was natural. But blood, dark, wet, lingering, felt deliberate. It suggested circulation. And circulation implied purpose. When communities reopened graves during times of plague or famine, they often encountered bodies that defied expectation. Lips stained red. Blood pooled in the chest. Liquid seeping from the mouth or nose. To modern science, these were consequences of pressure, gravity, and decomposition. But to pre-modern observers, blood did not move without meaning. Blood was believed to answer hunger. In Slavic, Balkan, and early Germanic traditions, blood held a sacred ambiguity. It was both life and oath, sacrifice and inheritance. When blood appeared after burial, it was read as refusal, the body resisting stillness. The corpse, though silent, seemed nourished. Chroniclers recorded these moments with calm certainty. They did not write of shock, but of confirmation. The dead had been suspected already. Blood merely agreed. This belief shaped how illness was understood. When entire households weakened after a death, explanation demanded proximity. The living did not imagine fanged creatures stalking at night. Instead, they feared a slow exchange. Life drawn away through unseen means. Not attack but absorption. Blood then became proof of theft. Not stolen violently, but borrowed endlessly. In this worldview, the dead did not hunt. They fed passively, drawing vitality as roots draw water. The living grew pale, exhausted, hollowed. Children failed first. Livestock followed. The pattern repeated often enough to feel undeniable. And blood explained it. The corpse that bled was not empty. It was sustained. This interpretation transformed burial into surveillance. Graves were watched. Corpses examined. Mouths inspected for stains. Coffins reopened with ritual solemnity. Blood became the deciding factor. If found, action followed. These actions were not driven by panic, but by responsibility. To allow the dead to continue feeding was to endanger the living. Blood was not horror, it was warning. And so it was released. Bodies were pierced to drain it. Hearts were cut. Mouths packed with earth. Blood was spilled deliberately to break its circulation, to end the conversation between corpse and community. In this moment, the myth had not yet formed, but the logic had. The dead were not monsters. They were participants. Blood made that participation visible. And once seen, it could not be ignored. The dead were expected to be still. Stillness was proof. Silence was reassurance. A body at rest confirmed that death had sealed itself properly. But the dead did not always obey. In the hours and days following burial, bodies changed in ways that disturbed the living. Limbs stiffened, then relaxed. The abdomen swelled. Gases escaped through the throat, producing sounds that resembled breath, or worse, speech. Fluids leaked. Skin tightened. Hair appeared longer. Nails darkened and curved. To those who watched without explanation, the corpse felt restless. This restlessness did not suggest aggression. It suggested resistance. Across Eastern Europe and the Slavic world, folklore described the unquiet dead as bodies that decayed incorrectly. They did not rot as expected. They remained too intact, too expressive, too present. A corpse that bloated was not swelling, it was feeding. A corpse that groaned was not releasing gas, it was protesting. These interpretations did not arise from imagination, but observation. Grave diggers reported bodies that shifted when moved, coffins that creaked, corpses that bled when pierced, sighed when turned, or moaned when staked. Each reaction deepened the conviction that something inside remained aware. The unquiet corpse threatened the boundary itself. If a body could move without life, then life was no longer required for action. Death became porous, identity uncertain. This fear was not theatrical. It was intimate. The dead were not strangers. They were parents, neighbors, children. Familiar faces behaving incorrectly. Communities feared this not because it was monstrous, but because it was wrong. In ancient belief systems, wrongness carried consequence. Improper burial, unfinished rites, unresolved emotions, any of these could disturb the transition from life to death. The soul lingered. The body became its anchor. And anchors pulled downward. The unquiet corpse was thought to drain energy simply by existing too close to the living. Did not rise. Did not roam. It waited. And in waiting it consumed. This belief shaped vigilance. Graves were revisited. Bodies re-examined. A corpse that changed too much became suspect. Stillness became the gold standard of safety. If the dead moved, something had failed. And failure demanded correction. Thus, intervention became normalized. Bodies were repositioned. Limbs restrained. Heads severed to prevent awareness. Mouths sealed to prevent calling. The goal was not cruelty but certainty. The unquiet corpse was a reminder that death could be delayed, resisted, or reversed in part. And that possibility terrified the living more than any later monster ever would. Because it meant death was not final, only unfinished. Before science learned to open the body, it learned to watch it. Early medicine was not built on instruments or anatomy, but on patience. Healers observed the living as they weakened and the dead as they changed. Patterns emerged slowly, not as hypotheses, but as stories written into flesh. When death arrived, it did not end observation, it intensified it. The corpse became a teacher. In a world without microscopes or dissection, decay itself was the evidence. The body's transformation after burial was studied not with curiosity, but with consequence. Every change mattered. Every anomaly carried meaning. A swollen abdomen suggested fullness. Blood pooling in the chest implied circulation. Fluids at the mouth resembled recent feeding. Sounds escaping the throat sounded like breath struggling to return. To modern eyes, these were natural stages of decomposition. But to early healers they were symptoms. And symptoms require diagnosis. When disease spread after a death, the grave was implicated. This was not superstition, it was logic shaped by limitation. Illness followed burial often enough to suggest connection. Families weakened in sequence. Villages lost strength collectively. The dead appeared unchanged while the living faded. The conclusion felt unavoidable. The dead were drawing something from the living. Medical texts from the medieval period describe corpses that resisted decay as dangerous. A body that remained intact too long was believed to retain life force improperly. Flesh that did not collapse into rot was suspicious. Preservation meant imbalance. Decay was expected. Its absence was feared. Early physicians believed the body held humors even after death. Blood, bile, phlegm. These substances were thought to continue interacting within the corpse. If not released, they stagnated. And stagnation corrupted. The corpse, then, became a vessel of trapped vitality. This belief reshaped post-mortem care. Bodies were opened not for study, but for safety. Blood was drained intentionally. Organs pierced. Hearts cut or burned. These acts were not punishment, they were treatment. The dead were patients whose condition threatened the living. Medicine and ritual overlapped seamlessly. There was no boundary between healer and priest, between diagnosis and prayer. A body that behaved incorrectly demanded intervention from both. And because these practices sometimes coincided with the end of illness, they reinforced belief. Correlation hardened into cure. If sickness subsided after the corpse was pierced, then piercing worked. If exhaustion lifted after the grave was sealed more tightly, then containment succeeded. These outcomes were remembered, recorded, repeated. Thus, a medical tradition formed, not of anatomy, but of prevention. The dead were not evil. They were unregulated. And regulation was the task of the living. This worldview did not imagine monsters lurking in darkness. It imagined imbalance. Life force misallocated. Vitality leaking in the wrong direction. The corpse was not an enemy, it was a malfunction. And malfunctions required correction. Medicine in this era was not about saving the dead. It was about protecting the living from what the dead might become. There was no monster yet. Fear existed, but it had no image. No name. No form that could be pointed to or destroyed. It moved instead through sensation, through fatigue, anxiety, and quiet dread that settled over entire communities. This was fear at its most powerful. In villages struck by repeated death, something lingered after burial. Not a presence that could be seen, but a weight that could be felt. People slept poorly. Livestock weakened. Children failed to thrive. The air itself seemed tired. No one spoke of creatures. They spoke of wrongness. Fear without a face cannot be confronted. It cannot be hunted or named. It spreads because it cannot be contained by story. Communities sensed patterns but lacked language. They knew the grave mattered, but not how. Death radiated outward like cold. Proximity felt dangerous. Distance felt safer. Homes near burial grounds were avoided. As shifted. Daily life reorganized itself around an invisible threat. This fear was communal, not individual. It did not isolate, it unified. Everyone felt it. Everyone adjusted. Silence grew heavy after dusk. Windows were shuttered earlier. Fires burned longer. Names of the dead were avoided. To speak them aloud felt like invitation. Fear had not yet learned how to dramatize itself. Instead it seeped. It lived in the pauses between sentences. In the way people looked back at graves while walking away. In the way bodies were buried faster, deeper, heavier. The absence of form made fear omnipresent. If the threat had no shape, it could be anywhere. In the soil. In the air. In memory itself. This was the terror of uncertainty. When fear has no face, it turns inward. People began to monitor each other more closely. Weakness became suspicious. Illness became contagious beyond the body. Someone had to be responsible. And without a monster to blame, responsibility hovered everywhere. This stage of belief was fragile. Could have dissolved into reason. Could have been replaced by knowledge. But instead it waited. Fear waits patiently. All it needs is repetition. And repetition came. Illness followed death again. And again. And again. Each cycle reinforced the idea that something unseen persisted beyond burial. Something active. something involved. Still no image emerged. Not yet. Fear remained a presence without a face. And because of that it grew. When fear could not be seen, it was buried. Graves were never meant to be final resting places alone. In many ancient societies they were barriers, designed not just to hold the dead but to restrain them. Burial was no longer an act of farewell. It became an act of defense. Across cultures separated by distance and language, remarkably similar solutions emerged. Bodies were weighed down with stones. Limbs were bound. Heads were turned, severed, or placed between the legs. Mouths were filled with earth, ash, bricks, or iron. Stakes pierced chests. Coffins were reinforced. Graves were sealed as if something inside might push back. These practices were not random expressions of fear. They followed a grim internal logic. If the dead could move, they could act. If they could speak, they could summon. If they could rise, they could drain. Stillness became safety. Archaeological evidence reveals this pattern repeatedly. Medieval graves in Eastern Europe show stones pressed against throats and chests. Roman-era burials contain nails driven through limbs. Slavic graves hold bodies buried face down, denying the dead the orientation of return. To modern eyes, these acts appear violent. But to those who performed them, they were preventative. They were meant to neutralize uncertainty. The living were not punishing the dead. They were protecting themselves. Burial rituals grew increasingly precise. Bodies were washed to remove lingering vitality, positioned carefully to prevent motion, watched before interment to ensure stillness had truly arrived. The moment of burial mattered. Too early risked unrest, too late risked decay's corruption spreading. Every detail was scrutinized. Iron in particular carried protective weight. It was believed to disrupt the unnatural. Placed across the chest or in the mouth, it functioned as a barrier between the corpse and whatever lingered within. Iron did not kill, it interrupted. Soil was also symbolic. Filling the mouth prevented speech. Speech in early belief carried power. A corpse that could speak could call. And a call from the grave was dangerous. The head was treated with special care. It was believed to house identity, memory, and intention. Severing it did not destroy the dead, it confused them. A body without orientation could not return properly. These methods spread not because of superstition but because they worked, at least in perception. When illness subsided after intervention, belief hardened. The ritual succeeded. The danger had been contained. Fear learned from results. Over time, burial became architecture. Graves were constructed not for peace, but for pressure. The earth itself was enlisted as a collaborator. Weight mattered. Depth mattered. Distance mattered. The dead were not feared for what they might do violently. They were feared for what they might continue doing silently. This defensive burial culture reveals something crucial. Early humans did not imagine the dead as enemies. They imagined them as unstable forces, capable of unintended harm simply by remaining too present. The grave was a boundary, reinforced again and again, because the living did not trust death to hold. When fear cannot be destroyed, it searches for a vessel. In communities haunted by unexplained illness and lingering death, suspicion rarely settled on the strong or familiar. It drifted instead toward the margins, toward those who lived differently, who stood apart, who unsettled the quiet order of the village. Outsiders were remembered differently after death. The unmarried, the sick, poor, healers, foreigners, women without kin, men without lineage, those who spoke too little or knew too much. Difference in life became danger in death. When graves were opened in search of answers, these bodies were often the first examined. Their decay was interpreted more harshly. Their post-mortem changes seemed more suspicious. Their blood appeared more threatening. Fear sharpened memory. Communities reconstructed narratives around these individuals. A strange habit became a sign. An old argument became motive. Illness became evidence of corruption rather than misfortune. The dead were no longer just unquiet, they were culpable. This transformation marked a critical shift. Fear turned moral. What had once been anxiety about decay became judgment about character. The body's behavior in death was linked to the person's behavior in life. Improper living was believed to produce improper dying. Those accused were rarely powerful. They were those least able to defend themselves. Scapegoating emerged not from cruelty, but from desperation. Someone had to be responsible. Chaos demanded explanation. And explanation required blame. The dead could not argue. Once labeled dangerous, these individuals were subjected to harsher burial practices. Stakes driven deeper. Heads removed. Bodies burned or dismembered. Their graves isolated from the rest. These acts did not end fear, but they focused it. The monster had not yet gained fangs, but it had gained identity. An identity made fear easier to manage. This process reveals a darker truth. Belief does not merely explain fear, it organizes power. By assigning danger to specific bodies, communities reassured themselves that safety could be restored through control. The living blamed the dead not because they were certain, but because uncertainty was unbearable. And so the myth began to narrow. From all graves to certain graves. From all deaths to specific deaths. From fear itself to a face it could finally accuse. There came a moment when fear no longer whispered, testified. Blood transformed suspicion into certainty. What had once been interpreted through intuition now appeared tangible, visible, undeniable. In villages already primed by illness and loss, the sight of blood within the grave ended debate. The dead were no longer merely suspected. They were proven. In pre-modern belief, blood did not lie. When graves were reopened, the body was examined with ritual care. Cloth was peeled back slowly. Faces were inspected first. The mouth held particular authority. Blood found there carried unmistakable meaning. It implied recent nourishment. A corpse that bled had not emptied itself. Something had sustained it. Chroniclers across Eastern and Central Europe recorded these moments with alarming calm. Priests, magistrates, and physicians stood witness. They did not write of horror, but of confirmation. The evidence aligned with expectation. The dead were feeding. This was not folklore spoken in darkness. It was observation recorded in ink. Official documents from the 16th and 17th centuries describe exhumations carried out under church authority. Corpses were inspected publicly. Villagers gathered not in panic, but in solemn resolve. Blood was shown. Judgments were passed. Fear had entered bureaucracy. Once blood was accepted as proof, action followed naturally. The corpse was pierced, decapitated, burned, or dismembered. Blood was drained deliberately, spilled to end circulation. These acts were framed as necessary remedies. Not punishments but corrections. The logic was simple. If blood sustained the dead, then releasing it would starve them. What mattered most was that these interventions often coincided with relief. Illness slowed. Death paused. The village breathed again. Correlation reinforced belief. The ritual had worked. And once something works, it becomes law. Blood thus became a legal threshold. A sign that transformed rumor into mandate. No longer did fear require imagination, it required inspection. The dead were now subject to investigation. This moment marked a turning point in the evolution of the myth. Fear was no longer communal and abstract. It was procedural, evidence-based, sanctioned. The dead were not hunted, they were audited. And blood was the ledger. This hunger was not sudden. It did not tear flesh or stalk the night. It worked slowly, invisibly, patiently. The dead were believed to consume not bodies, but vitality. Not blood directly but the strength it carried. This was hunger without violence. Families weakened together. First came exhaustion, then illness, then death. The pattern felt intimate, targeted, deliberate. The dead were not attacking strangers. They were draining those closest to them. Kinship became a conduit. In many traditions, the restless dead were believed to feed on familiarity. The bond between the living and the dead did not dissolve. It reversed. Love became vulnerability. Memory became access. This belief explained why entire households collapsed after a single burial. The dead drew life from those who mourned them most deeply. Grief itself became dangerous. The hunger was passive. The corpse did not rise. It remained buried, anchored, waiting. Its appetite radiated outward, thinning the living like frost. This idea terrified communities because it could not be escaped by vigilance alone. Locks meant nothing. Distance helped but not completely. The dead fed through connection. To survive, one had to sever bonds. Mourning rituals changed accordingly. Excessive grief was discouraged. Prolonged remembrance was feared. To dwell too long on the dead was to invite them closer. Silence became protection. The dead were not monsters in this belief system. They were consumers of proximity. Their hunger was not malicious. It was automatic. Like decay itself, it simply happened. This framed the dead as tragic rather than evil. They fed because they had not finished dying. But tragedy did not lessen danger. The living learned to respond not with confrontation, but with separation. Graves were moved farther from settlements. Burial grounds isolated. Names avoided. Objects belonging to the dead destroyed or removed. To starve the dead, one had to forget them. This belief reveals a profound psychological tension. The conflict between remembrance and survival. To remember was to risk. To forget was to live. Hunger after death forced communities to choose. And slowly, this hunger began to change shape. What had once been invisible would soon demand imagery. What had fed silently would soon be imagined as deliberate. Hunger would grow teeth. But not yet. For now, it remained a quiet draining, a belief that death, unfinished, could still take. As observation reached its limits, belief turned to ritual. Where medicine and reason failed, faith imposed order. The restless dead were reframed as corrupted souls, bodies no longer neutral but morally compromised. Illness, hunger, decay. These became signs not of biological process, but of spiritual failure. Death without proper repose was interpreted as a warning. The soul had not departed. And if the soul lingered, it could affect the living, channeling misfortune, weakness, or disease. Religion, in this sense, did not eliminate fear, it organized it. Priests and clergy became arbiters of safety. Sacred rites were extended beyond the funeral. Crosses and holy water were placed directly on graves. Incense and prayers were repeated over the site of unrest. The act of speaking to the dead replaced silent observation, of course tempered by ritual authority. Exorcisms were performed over coffins, turning burial grounds into spaces of contest. The earthly versus the spiritual. Holy authority confronted what human hands could not restrain. Rituals became precise and codified. Staking of corpses, decapitation, sealing of mouths. Actions once justified by fear and logic were now reinforced by religious sanction. Each practice was accompanied by prayer, blessing, or confession. Where medical intervention addressed the body, faith intervened in the soul. Where decay was misread as hunger, ritual framed it as sin. The living no longer confronted the dead as mere anomaly. They confronted the dead as moral adversaries. What had been observed as passive feeding became deliberate corruption. And this moralization of fear shifted the conversation. It was no longer about survival alone but salvation. Faith transformed anxiety into narrative. Death was no longer a neutral event. It carried meaning. Improper burial, neglected rites, sinful life, or unrepentant behavior were now causal factors, explaining phenomena previously unaccounted for. The dead were morally accountable for the living's suffering, and communities found purpose in this interpretation. This shift altered social behavior profoundly. Mourning became ritualized but cautious. Families adhered strictly to rites, performing them precisely to prevent unrest. Deviations were feared. Oversight became moral responsibility. Entire communities became vigilant, not merely in caring for the living, but in placating the dead. Religion thus extended the reach of fear. It could be measured, addressed, and codified, but it could not be eliminated. The invisible threat, the lingering hunger, the slow drain of vitality, remained, now refracted through the lens of theology. Holy symbols became armor, prayers became shields, and ritualized gestures replaced observation and empiricism. Faith offered solace, but at a cost. It demanded constant attention, repetition, and obedience. Failure was not merely misfortune, it was proof of the dead's potential agency. In this way, fear became both communal and hierarchical. Power was exercised over bodies both living and dead, and authority was justified by the threat of what lay beneath the earth. Yet, even as theology imposed structure, it could not end mystery. The dead were now moral actors, but their motives remained unknowable. Their hunger, their presence, their persistence, these were interpreted as deliberate, but no one could see fully into the grave. This is the critical juncture in the evolution of myth. Faith has organized fear, but it has also dramatized it. The passive threat becomes a moral one. Observation becomes accusation. Medicine becomes law. And the first narrative outlines of what will eventually become the vampire myth are now fully taking shape. Even without fangs, even without wings, the dead have acquired agency, and in that agency, a story that will persist for centuries. Stories are how we give form to fear. Long before the vampire appeared in literature, fear had been observed, reasoned, ritualized, and moralized. But even with faith imposing order, the invisible threat lingered. The dead were still restless, hunger still invisible, decay still misunderstood. To contain fear, humans turned it into narrative. They gave it repetition, memory, and form. Oral tradition became the crucible. Tales of the unquiet corpse, of blood at the mouth, of death that lingered too close, were repeated at hearths, in churchyards, and at village boundaries. Each retelling amplified the details that reinforced caution. The lips red with blood, the swelling of the corpse, the sighing in the night. Each account codified what had once been ambiguous. What was observation became story. What was story became legend. These narratives traveled slowly, but persistently. Across Slavic, Germanic, and Balkan lands, the same motifs reappeared. The restless dead, the feeding corpse, the death that did not end. The details crystallized. Bodies had intentions. Graves became thresholds. Blood became a signature. The unquiet dead gained personality, consistency, and habit. In every story, fear found a shape. That shape was not yet the vampire we recognize today, but it was something more than absence. It had rules. It had patterns. The passive became active, but only through imagination. Communities no longer feared randomness. They feared recurrence. The stories taught them how the dead might behave. The patterns imposed predictability on terror. In this shaping of narrative, culture itself becomes the medium. Artifacts, chronicles, church records, and songs reinforced oral tradition. Illustrations in manuscripts depicted corpses as swollen, restless, and sometimes animated. Ritual practices were described in vivid detail. The living encoded their fear into memory, into culture, into story. This process reveals something essential. Fear needs repetition to survive. Observation alone is ephemeral. Ritual stabilizes it, but story immortalizes it. Once given voice and image, fear acquires resilience. It moves beyond the individual and embeds itself in communal consciousness. Stories also democratized fear. Even those who never witnessed an unquiet corpse or a bleeding grave could participate in the narrative. Knowledge spread beyond experience. The dead gained presence everywhere. Fear became universal because the story traveled. And in this universality, the dead became something symbolic. They were no longer just bodies, they were warnings, lessons, moral actors. The unquiet corpse was no longer simply dangerous. It was meaningful. Its presence carried instruction. Honor the dead, follow ritual, respect boundaries. Stories became the architecture of fear. They gave the invisible shape, sequence, and expectation. They taught how to recognize danger, how to intervene, how to survive. And most importantly, they gave continuity. The dead of yesterday spoke to the living of today. The fear that could not be eliminated was encoded into narrative memory. Oral tradition, manuscript, ritual, and observation fused into a single form. The story of the unquiet dead, the passive feeder, the first proto-vampire. By the time these stories were recorded in chronicles, in legends, in folktales, the stage was set. The formless fear had become something that could be recognized. It had rules, it had history, and it had a voice. And when fear acquires voice, it waits only for imagination to complete the picture. Fangs arrived late. Long after corpses were watched, graves fortified, and blood interpreted, the figure we now call the vampire began to emerge. It was not born of fantasy alone, nor of imagination untethered. It was the crystallization of centuries of observation, fear, ritual, and story. The dead had always lingered. They had always hung between worlds, feeding invisibly, unervingly. But in these early centuries they were not monsters. They were persistent presences, ambiguous forces, moral actors, and passive consumers. It was the stories that gave them teeth. The ritualized interpretations that gave them will. The imagination that gave them menace. By the late medieval period, in the folklore of Eastern Europe, the features began to coalesce. Blood at the mouth, once interpreted as proof of lingering life, became a sign of deliberate predation. Graves were desecrated not merely for observation, but for prevention. Evidence was no longer passive. It was suggestive. The unquiet dead had agency. And agency demanded a form. Descriptions grew more vivid. Red eyes, sharp teeth, swollen bodies. Nights haunted by their absence yet ever-present threat. The vampire, as we now recognize it, did not leap from imagination. It was built slowly, from generations of careful attention. Its habits were documented. Its rules codified. The pattern of its behavior, rising from the grave, draining vitality, haunting kin, emerged directly from centuries of misinterpreted observation and ritual. But in this birth, the vampire was not yet the romanticized figure of modern fiction. It was grotesque, terrifying, and morally loaded. It was the intersection of biology, psychology, and social anxiety, a reflection of the human need to understand, to control, and to warn. The vampire gave a name to the passive fear that had existed for centuries. It gave face to hunger, morality to the unquiet, and narrative to the formless dread. Priests, magistrates, and chroniclers played a role in this emergence. Accounts of exhumed corpses were recorded, publicized, and sometimes embellished. These records reinforced belief. They shaped ritual. They shaped story. Communities learned from one another. Regional differences blurred. The vampire became a shared cultural construct, a mirror of communal fear. By the 18th century, the vampire was fully formed in folklore, a creature with intent, purpose, and appetite. It was no longer the ambiguous force of chapters 2 and 3. Now it acted with deliberation. It hunted, it consumed, it returned. The hunger that had been passive, collective, and moralized became personal, individualized, and terrifyingly direct. Yet even as the vampire gained menace, its roots remained human. Its behavior mirrored what had been observed in the unquiet dead. Swelling, post-mortem bleeding, lingering presence, and the connection between the living and the dead. It was a myth built upon empirical anxiety, ritualized observation, and cultural codification. In this way, the vampire is not a departure from history. It is its culmination. Centuries of fear, of observation, of ritual, of story, coalesced into one figure. A single face for 1,000 anxieties. And it endures because fear always seeks shape. Because hunger, unresolved, always becomes tangible. Because the dead, once imagined, demand recognition. The vampire did not invent dread. It refined it, edited it, polished it until it became unforgettable. And once perfected, it never left us. The true fear was never the fangs. It was not the nightly hunt, nor the shape, nor the bite. It was the uncertainty, the ambivalence of endings. The way death could linger, stretch, and intrude upon the living. It was the anxiety of incompletion. The dead who would not stay buried, whose presence seeped into families, villages, and memory. The vampire, the fabled predator, is only the final face of a much older fear. That fear began when people first noticed that death was not absolute, that bodies could behave unpredictably, that illness followed death, and not always in a rational pattern, that blood could appear where it should not, that bodies moved, sighed, and changed, that grief itself could endanger the living. This was the dread that demanded ritual, that drove exhumations, that inspired oral tradition. The vampire only gave that dread teeth. But why did it endure? Because fear unresolved needs form. Because hunger unseen must be imagined. Because the dead, even when passive, challenged the living's assumption of finality. Communities invented monsters not because they were cruel, but because they could not otherwise manage the anxiety of endings. The vampire is a testament to that need. The embodiment of a question humans have always asked. What happens when life does not end? Even today, the myth persists because we continue to fear the same things. Uncertainty, memory, connection beyond death. The vampire endures because it asks the question we cannot answer. It gives face to the formless, voice to the silent, and appetite to the lingering. In these centuries, fear became culture. Fear became story. Fear became ritual, morality, and law. And then, finally, it became myth. The unquiet dead evolved into the vampire not because imagination invented it, but because generations observed, feared, and remembered what they did not understand. The vampire is not merely a creature of fiction. It is a mirror of human anxiety, human care, human observation, and human mortality. It is the embodiment of the tension between life and death, memory and forgetfulness, continuity and finality. And what is truly haunting is this. The vampire's fangs are irrelevant. They do not matter. The real terror lies in the questions the vampire asks of us. How do we honor the dead? How do we live knowing death does not always end? How do we respond when the boundary between life and death is porous, unpredictable, unresolved? All the legends, all the stories, all the rituals are attempts to answer these questions. Each exhumation, each prayer, each tale of hunger is a human attempt to contain uncertainty. We feared not monsters. We feared the fragility of life, the persistence of death, and our inability to control what lies beyond. And that fear is eternal. Because the dead do not simply vanish. They linger, in memory, in story, in ritual, in myth. And in that lingering they ask the questions we still cannot answer.